Normally, a story of this nature would not be on Dug Up. It's the kind of sleazy, sordid journalism that just doesn't appeal to us. It's not bad, it's news, it's journalism, but usually we like to deal with the more fleshy stuff than the fatty one. But as that particular story unfolded, something happened that changed the game totally, at least totally for us. A journalist was arrested in the middle of that story, and that made alarm bells ring almost instantly. And from that moment, it became a story that interested us. So, about a week ago, Ollah 10, a celebrity rapper, appeared on the Ollah 7 podcast show. The episode in question, well, it was heated, and that is an understatement. That is to say the least. You know, Ollah 10 as a person, he shoots from the hip, and fire he did, kickstarting a chain of events that ended with top level officials scrambling around. Like literally, you had from top to bottom people running around in circles trying to figure out what's going on and what can be done. Anyway, here's what happened in summary, you know, in case you didn't quite catch it. We'll run you through it. So on the day in question, Ollah 10 appeared on a podcast hosted by Ollah 7. He made a series of allegations and claims about several people. Clips went viral, and the people who were name dropped in those clips, they were incensed. One comedian wrote a letter of demand. Mdiwa Hood, a local businessman, announced that he would take legal action. And a day after that announcement, in an exchange on X, Mdiwa raised objections towards Ollah, who's the host of the podcast show. And he was saying that his reputation had been soiled. Ollah responded by offering Mdiwa a chance to defend himself. And I think during the same day, a fake letter from some phantom lawyers also did the rounds, claiming that Mdiwa and then Uebert Angel, they were suing, Ollah 7 or Ollah 10 for a lot of money. But that was quickly dispelled. The lawyers don't exist, and the letter itself is fake. There were discussions though in the background. The thing is, Ollah 7 and Mdiwa are known to each other, and prior to this, they had been very cordial. You're talking about people who've got each other's contacts. At the same time, Ollah 7 was receiving death threats from several parties, and that led to him announcing that he was going to live stream on social media and saying that he wasn't safe. At the time, Uebert Angel was widely quoted as being responsible for that. In the background, there were discussions about potential mediation happening on Friday night and then some mediation on Saturday morning. But these didn't materialize, and the matter escalated. At some point, Ollah handed himself over to the police. Initially, there were reports that he would be released, but then he wasn't released. He was sent to the cells. Local papers reported that Ollah 10 was on the run. Ollah 10 in turn posted a video dancing, implying that he was fine. And then come Sunday, the big bombshell. Ollah apologized, then Ollah 10 also apologized and said he was drunk and that he had been served alcohol while appearing on the podcast. And he basically retracted everything, and he blamed alcohol, and he said the host had manipulated him. He said the interview wasn't live and that the host should have edited out stuff that he was saying because he knew it was potentially harmful. He just basically turned around and said, I didn't do it, I'm not responsible, it was alcohol. And then he apologized, not just to Mdiwa, but to Uebert Angel and everybody who was involved. So that's just about it, really. So the question, I guess, is what really happened and what does that mean? Well, we have a lot to unpack about Uebert Angel, about Mdiwa Hood, what happened, and the various factors at play. This isn't a new story, I have to point that out. It's much rather an analysis. We've been doing investigations and news, but you've been banging the drum saying you want analysis, you want opinions. So we're giving you what you want. This is a bit of opinion, a bit of analysis with a hint of inside knowledge. It wouldn't be dug up if there was no inside knowledge. So to start off, we need to have a look at what happened at the podcast itself. So journalists disseminate information, but so can anybody else really. The difference between journalism and content creation is the gatekeeping process. That distinction is very important, and it's the reason why journalists are useful but respected, and citizen journalists are not really respected. That gatekeeping process is absent in the work of a citizen journalist, and more often than not, it shows in the output that they bring out. But that on its own is a story for another day. We need to go back to the process, the gatekeeping process that I mentioned. See, journalists have a bunch of standards and tests that they must apply to any news gathering process and any kind of news dissemination. This is to protect the integrity of their work, the integrity of what reaches their readers' ears, as well as to ensure that what they produce is solid and it protects them. Now, Ollah 7 is a trained journalist. I need to point that out in case you then get the impression that I'm saying he's a citizen journalist. He's not. I have to point that out. And he has worked in the mainstream media for a while. But in that particular episode, the one with Holy 10, journalism didn't happen in that episode. And this is why. Because a number of fundamental things that are key in the news gathering process and the gatekeeping process just didn't happen. You see, things tend to happen this way. If an interview is live, producers often work with something that's called a delay. Sometimes that stretches between 10 seconds or 30 seconds. A delay is useful because it helps filter out profanity or mute parts where a guest might say something that causes legal issues like libel. And libel is something we'll mention a lot in this episode because that is one thing that journalists tend to struggle with a lot. If an interview is not live, there are steps like challenging any claims put forward and also stating in clear terms what's just been said by a guest has not been proven and that there isn't any evidence of that, along a plethora of other options that a presenter can use to ensure that it's clear to the readers that the information that is being shared is spontaneous and unverified. There should also be an attempt to prove or to disprove any allegations that guests may make in a show. And at the same time, there should also be an effort to put the actual allegations to the parties named in the episode. So for instance, you'd go to person A and say, hey, we had a podcast, this person said 1, 2, 3, 4 things about you. Do you want to respond? Do you have means to provide a statement of contradiction, a statement of explanation, or otherwise? These processes exist to protect both the journalists working on a story and the readers. But more than anything, they actually protect the journalists themselves. Most times, a person who publishes a false statement is the subject of the defamation suit. And I would say in countries where everything functions, journalists usually avoid publishing potentially defamatory stuff because the consequences for doing so are quite hefty. By the way, and I need to make this straight because people like to connect dots, this isn't a criticism of Ollah at all. It's an analysis of the little gaps that opened him up and his show to some problems, and gaps that have been exploited and might be exploited in future. So having said that, my analysis is that journalism didn't quite happen with that episode. But look, this happens to all of us in the industry. You can't always tick every box and you can't always prepare for the worst case scenario. You do your best, and I mean, I know Ollah, I speak to him, he's a very good journalist and I know he would have put all of his effort, but there was just that little factor where some boxes were left open and they've been capitalized on. The next issue, which is probably important, is how the arrest itself can and probably will hurt journalists. And this was the thing that then made us at Dug Up sort of turn around and say, hey, can we do something about this? You see, Ollah's arrest has created a template. A precedent has now been set. People now know that you can get reporters arrested, and that's not a good thing, because you will have people who now sit back and think, I did A, B, C, D the police are not really assessing whether or not what someone has done is valid or if it's grounds for a charge. They're just arresting people because by the letter of the law, the act itself that's been used is quite broad, it's quite vague, and you're going to have people try to settle petty scores with journalists. On X, formerly Twitter, somebody said the same thing, and George Charamba, the spokesperson for the president, he agreed with those sentiments when they were raised on X, and he sort of agreed that there was a chance that this would be used to settle petty scores against journalists. He was responding to somebody who is identified as a doctor, I think, who has trained a number of journalists, because the person says this could set a bad precedent where a lot of my students could find themselves targeted. And in so doing, we kind of figured that that person is trained journalist, and George was responding to that. And he thought it was a bad law, and he conceded that that law could be used to do that, to target journalists. And we also know that there are significant concerns, especially among the different little and big, lest I be accused of saying something else, among the little and big rights groups in Zimbabwe. We know and we understand that from the time that it was sort of clear that Ollah was being looked for by the police, Mr. Zimbabwe, were alerted. Mr. do a lot of work to deploy lawyers to assist journalists that are in crisis. They were alerted and began working on helping Ollah. That was being done by journalists. Some were here and some was in Zimbabwe. We also understand that on Saturday, Bamu, who is a human rights lawyer, was dispatched to Harare Central Police Station to help. I haven't confirmed that myself, but I do know that a colleague within Dagap did say that he had been told that this is what had happened, and he's the same colleague who had been trying to coordinate with Mr. Zimbabwe to try and get help to Ollah. I think, and this is a prediction, not a statement of fact, I think that a statement from both Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights or from MISA might end up getting released today or tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised if other, things like, different missions, either the European Union or the UK in Zimbabwe, if they say something about it, because, it's the arrest of a journalist. And in terms of consequences, this issue won't just be about Mniwa or about Ollah 7 or the other people who are mentioned, but I think it will become an issue about press freedom. There's a lot of individuals involved, Mniwa, Uebert Angel, Mama V, the comedian, and several other people. But there will be that conversation now about press freedom, because the person who is in jail is a journalist, and there's already some concerns about journalism, although we'll get to those later. I know that prior to this video, in our different groups, like the Dug Up ones and the others where we exist as colleagues, journalism groups in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwean journalists working in South Africa, there is a concession and a general worry that the day of that arrest, Saturday, was a dark day for journalism. A very dark day, because many reporters will now be scared to report anything, and you kind of have to understand them. Look at it this way, right? Blessed Mhlanga is in jail. Watson Munyaka was killed. There's no evidence that Watson was killed for his journalism, by the way, nor is there evidence that he was killed for his job as a tech gadgets retailer. But he was working as a journalist, so people will still join the dots. And now Ollah 7 gets arrested for words that he didn't speak himself. And whether we like it or not, it will cause many people to self-censor. Many people who have either less platforms or less access to resources, or, Ollah 7 met the president, for instance. So younger journalists who don't have that kind of power will look at it and think, I don't want to go down that route. I could mention someone, even if it's allegedly, and I could still take the steps to try and, I could make journalism happen. I could tick the boxes, and I could still get arrested. Because at present, there are remedies for false and malicious, harassment, by the way. People can sue. Think Fadzimahele versus Petina Gapa, for instance. That's a classic case of something's being said, one party says it's defamatory, they take it to court, and they sue and they win. But the problem with that route is that it's prohibitively expensive, right? We are talking about costs that can easily get to $100,000 US. So for most people, defamation is not a viable route. This means that poor people can get defamed and they have no recourse. It's expensive to get a lawyer. It's expensive to get a lawyer who will argue in high court. In some instances, you need a lawyer, you need an advocate. So you're talking about quite a lot of money, which is never covered by the damages themselves. So we have an instance where the laws that protect ordinary people from being abused, they are necessary. And not just that the UK is a standard for anything, but if anyone went on a podcast and made half the claims that were made against another person here in the UK for no other reason but to cause humiliation and distress, it would be a police matter. In the UK, it would be a police matter. For example, almost 1,000 people were jailed for tweets in a 5-year period in Essex, a very small county in England, right? The Section 127 of the Communications Act, for instance, it makes it an offense to send messages that are grossly offensive or indecent or obscene or menacing in character. And that's been used to prosecute people for tweets. People who've said, if somebody said the things that Holy Ten said in a tweet in the UK, that they would be arrested for it. I've even got a little bit of the numbers. Between 2003 and 2011, for instance, 5,316 people were jailed for offenses related to internet posts, calls, and texts. So I'm sure you get the drift that in advanced democracies where the internet is regulated and policed properly, a lot of those words would actually, they have a criminal element, for instance. The problem though is that in Zimbabwe, this new law, this Data Protection Act, it hasn't been tested enough. And after the latest events, it's now open to abuse. Now, I think it will probably be taken to the Constitutional Court for rewording because it's too broad. But in the meantime, for journalists, it's scary. Now, when the issue happened, we had several people ask us some questions. One of them was about the disclaimer that, hey, look, Ollah 7 puts a disclaimer on his show. So why is being arrested when he says those views don't necessarily reflect his own views or that of the show? Well, I'm not an expert on Zimbabwe's media law, right? My training in media law is in England and Wales, right? So I don't even understand media law in places like Scotland because there'll be variances. But my understanding is that disclaimers are limited, and here's why. The responsibility to publish any material lies with the actual media house. It's the media house that has the responsibility to prevent the publication of any material that is criminal or that is defamatory. If the claims had been made on Holy Ten's Instagram, it would be a different story. The Ollah 7 podcast show are the ones that posted the episode. So they would have been the ones who did the publishing, because a critical element of libel is that the offense is committed when you publish. So defamation occurs when something is published. On to the other stuff, right? A radio or a TV show is not free from responsibility because they have a disclaimer. If they air a criminal threat on their show, for instance, they will be held accountable, right? You can't publish something and hide behind saying these are not my words, right? Retweeting a defamatory tweet is still considered defamation on its own, right? Retweeting libel is libel. Reposting libel is libel. I know some people will post something which is defamatory and then they'll say source and they think that excuses them because they're saying it's not my words. That doesn't matter. As long as you're the one who has published, you're the one who's responsible for it. In the UK, the issue of libel and defamation is so serious, along other criminal issues, that journalists are encouraged to read and be familiar with something called McNair's Essential Media Law for Journalists, right? When I was doing my MA at Nottingham Trent, I had to take critical media law lessons. That's because in the UK, it is very easy to land in prison for journalism. It is way, way easier to get in trouble for journalism in England than it is in Zimbabwe. I have a copy of McNair's Essential Media Law for Journalists, and it's quite clear that journalists have to take steps to ensure that everything that they publish is true. And that's because truth is it's the first defense of defamation. After that, you've got defenses like privilege or qualified privilege. That's when either something is said in court or it's a statement from the police, but there are remedies when it's, when it's coming from the police, or if it's an honestly held opinion. But your most reliable defense is gonna be truth. So in this case, though, it was always going to be difficult to prove. I don't want to repeat the allegations myself because I don't want to get sued, and I'll tell you why I don't want to repeat them as well towards the end of the show. So when you have guests claiming to have seen something, right, that on its own is not proof that that thing happened. Or at least in court, it wouldn't be enough proof to say, look, I think it's true because this guest says they were there. So when I looked at it the first time, I thought this is a textbook case, a textbook please sue me story. And that's the legal challenge with the story. Now that's done. We know when you come here, you expect some dug up stuff, even when we're here to just give you analysis. We know, we understand, you don't want to just come here and get opinion and get bones. You want the inside story of what happened. A lot of what I'll tell you next, it hinges on my own experiences and my own connections with people. So it's more from personal access than anything. It's not a stellar work of journalism. It just happened close to people that I know and that I've been around before in the past. So here's what we know happened. When the criminal case was opened, right, someone called Sergeant Piri from Harare Central Police Station began calling Ollah and asking him to report to the police on Thursday. Ollah didn't go to the police, right? And the next day, Piri went to Ollah's offices to look for him. And I think other different people also went there to look for him. In that same period, Ollah was receiving a number of threats. And our understanding is that these threats have also now been reported to lawyers for human rights. I think that was done by a colleague. And I think Ollah did eventually speak to the people from MISA as well, so they are aware about the threats. But nonetheless, when this happened, Ollah was terrified. And when he tweeted to say he's not safe, I mean, I spoke to him, he was terrified because, the threats were quite significant. And if I hadn't declared already, I speak to Ollah and I speak to Mdiwa, and as a brother to both, I initially attempted to intervene to prevent the issue from escalating, hoping that the two of them could sort of find each other. At the time, Ollah had been told that Uebert Angel was behind the threats and that it was Angel who was the one who was angry. And I did try to sort of follow that up, but when it happened, Uebert Angel was in Nigeria, right? He had actually been to Nigeria and was scheduled back to travel to Zimbabwe the next day, and I'll touch on Angel, much later. But our understanding is that Uebert Angel then returned to Zimbabwe on Friday late afternoon and went straight to the Hippodrome to address a service for later. It was during or towards the end of that service that he was told about the issue with Ollah. And from our understanding, that was the first time that he was hearing of it, because what Angel's been doing for quite a long time now is he has been keeping a very low profile. He's a son to Pastor Chris and has been trying to emulate him a lot. He's one of Pastor Chris's most favored sons. So for some years now, you'd almost think that Uebert Angel is around. Like, he can go for months unless you follow his services. He does these things under the radar, he does his church thing, but he's really, really down to earth, and he's trying to be away from the social media thing. And another thing, Angel doesn't follow social media stuff. From my experience when I worked for him, his pages are run by staff, and everyone around him is under strict instructions not to tell him nonsense. So even if he was being tagged or messages were being sent, he wouldn't have read that because he doesn't read that stuff. He says he'll be busy. But when this happened, both Ollah and Angel thought something was a play. And I mean, when Angel found out, Ollah was sure when he found out that it was about something else and that he thought Leo was acting on behalf of Angel. When Angel was made aware of this on Friday, he actually thought that it can't be, he thought that this can't be the story, maybe there's something else. And the people close to him now were telling me that he was asking why he is being made front and center of the story. But nonetheless, in that time, Angel proposed that since Leo and Ollah know each other, can't they work this issue out without necessarily, escalating things. So like I said, Angel generally wants to keep a low profile, wants peace, doesn't want to fight people. But at the same time, we also understand that the church, independent of Uebert Angel, was also planning to sue Ollah and to sue Holy 10 for that particular podcast, because they said the things claimed were being said to have happened at the church, and the church wanted to take action. But nonetheless, that sit down that Uebert Angel had suggested, it didn't happen. And then in the afternoon, we then found out when I woke up that Ollah had handed himself over to the police. So with Uebert Angel, right, this is the thing, because I know people want to know about Uebert Angel. Angel naturally doesn't sue people, generally, like ever, doesn't sue people, right? And generally Angel also doesn't respond personally. He doesn't respond, doesn't really get involved in social media stuff, not online. But Uebert Angel is a very dangerous person, right? Make no mistake about it. I say this is somebody who worked for him, right? Well, I worked for Bushiri, but I had access to Uebert Angel. He's like a grandfather to me. He's incredibly wealthy, right? I've been that close, I understand. And he's extremely powerful. That's a very, very nasty combination. Money and power are dangerous. So look, make no mistake about it. He's an extremely dangerous person. He's charming, he's soft, but he's a person who, despite his silence, he's got lines that he says, if you cross these absolute lines, it's curtains. So for that reason alone, I think it's understandable that Ollah 7 apologized, because the issue also stopped being about Mliwa. It roped in Uebert Angel, and Angel is not somebody that ordinarily someone want to mess with, because like I said, he can be really, when you see me with all my guts saying he can be dangerous, you understand what I mean. And I've seen colleagues saying that Ollah should have fought, Ollah shouldn't have apologized, Ollah amanya. But I think if we're brutally honest, once the fight became about Angel and not Mliwa, Ollah probably didn't have a choice, because Uebert Angel is more dangerous than people think, and I totally understand why that apologies happened. I mean, I've mentioned the loopholes that were there and that it become a legal case, but yeah. So I think in this case, what made it worse is that we know from a separate story we're doing that there were reports that content creators, one had a house bought or somebody had a minibus bought, and they were asked to fight like Uebert Angel. And a report of that nature was submitted and given, to Uebert Angel. And that scathing report left Uebert Angel quite, fuming, because, the people close to him were saying, hey, look, there are people that are being sponsored to attack you, and these people are being sent to politicians, some as far as going to the president to submit these reports. And Uebert Angel was livid, because one of those red lines that he talks about is his relationship with the president, who he continuously says he's very loyal to him. And his biggest weakness, that people say, is that he doesn't respond and he's quiet. But that's sort of, I think you sort of get the gist there. I don't want to say too much, because like I said, I don't want to get in trouble myself, because of the kind of person that we're dealing with. But now, going back to the story, it will be interesting to see where the story goes. Like I said, there's a valid conversation about press freedom and what this could mean. There's also a valid conversation about certain boxes that were not ticked. Especially now you've had the person who made the allegations come out and say it wasn't true, I was intoxicated, which raises a whole lot of other questions. If somebody's under the influence and you were involved with them physically, that would be a criminal offense. It would be a sexual offense. So the person saying, well, I was inhibited, I wasn't in my right senses, there's a challenge there, and it leaves the journalist in a very difficult position. There's a valid conversation definitely about the mistakes that were made in that podcast from an ethical perspective, from a legal perspective, and I think that's how we've ended where we are. The week will probably unfold new things, but that was your inside story of what happened with Ollah 7, Mliwa, and Uebert Angel, and what this means for press freedom. I'll probably write a story about it maybe next week. But anyway, guys, thank you for tuning in for this analysis. I'm really starting to enjoy doing analysis for you guys. I've been a purist. I just want to do investigations, but you guys really, you know, from the comments that we get, from the emails, from the feedback, you want a lot of analysis. You like the deep stuff, but sometimes you also want, you know, you want other lower stuff, other stuff that's chilled. So, you know, we'll give you that. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.